They consumed human flesh in rituals meant to save their souls, but instead they damned an entire community to silence. Before we descend into one of Appalachia's darkest chapters, tell us where you are listening from right now. Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're drawn to stories that reveal the shadowy corners of human nature, hit that subscribe button. Trust us. After what you're about to hear concerning the Whitford sisters, you'll want to be part of this journey through history's most haunting truths. Red Hollow, 1891. A name you won't find on modern maps. A place that made sure it disappeared from memory. Let's begin. To the Appalachian Mountains, the autumn of 1891 brought an early frost, painting the valleys around Red Hollow in shades of gray and amber. Like a funeral shroud, mist clung to the slopes, and beneath the wagon wheels of the few travelers brave enough to venture into these isolated hills, the dirt roads that connected the scattered homesteads turned to mud. Red Hollow was not a town. It barely qualified as a community. Mostly Scots-Irish immigrants, 37 families had pushed westward, seeking land and freedom from the crowded, music, eastern cities. From hand-hewn logs they built their cabins, from dense forest they cleared fields, and they kept largely to themselves. In places like this, neighbors were a mile apart, and for months at a time, winter could cut you off from the world. Hardened by isolation were the people here. They spoke little, trusted less, and about how others lived, they asked no questions. But even in a place where privacy was sacred, there were always whispers. At the edge of the settlement sat the Whitford cabin, where the cleared land gave way to the old-growth forest climbing the mountainside. Weathered gray by decades of rain and snow was the small structure, with a stone chimney that rarely showed smoke. A split-rail fence enclosed a yard where nothing grew except wild grass and thorny scrub. Alone since they were children, Abigail and Ruth Whitford had lived there. Their parents, Silas and Maeve Whitford, were remembered by the older residents, though not with any warmth. A quiet man who avoided church gatherings and town meetings had been Silas. Stranger still had been Maeve, a thin woman with hollow eyes who spoke with a thick accent that sounded older than the mountains themselves, carrying words that some of the eldest settlers recognized from the old country, phrases their own grandmothers had used in rituals they no longer spoke about in daylight. 10 years ago, their cabin had burned when Abigail was 14 and Ruth only 12. In the dead of night, the fire started, and by the time neighbors saw the flames lighting up the ridge, it was too late. In the ashes, Silas and Maeve's bodies were found, burned beyond recognition. Somehow escaping through a window, the girls survived. No one asked too many questions. Common enough in these mountains were fires, where a single spark from an improperly maintained stove could consume everything. Barely, the community helped the sisters rebuild, and then left them alone as was the custom. But different, darker, was the cabin that rose from those ashes. In the same spot it stood, but seemed to repel visitors in a way the old one never had. In near-total isolation, the girls grew up, seen only when they came to the trading post once every few months to exchange furs and foraged herbs for salt, flour, and the occasional tool. Abigail, now 24, had her mother's sharp features and unsettling gaze. Only when necessary did she speak, her voice low and measured. Softer in appearance was Ruth, 22, but no less distant. Rarely did her eyes meet anyone's, and with a nervous energy that made people uncomfortable, she moved. Like men they hunted and trapped, and better than most. In ways that even the oldest hunters didn't, they knew the forest. From hidden places they gathered plants, from rotted logs mushrooms, from beneath certain stones roots, berries that appeared only in the darkest parts of the wood. People noticed but said nothing. In Red Hollow, you minded your business. But in September of 1891, that unspoken agreement began to crack. For 6 years, Thomas Granger had been sheriff of Red Hollow. A solid man with graying hair was the 42-year-old, and the kind of face that inspired confidence. Steady, calm, difficult to rattle. He had served in the Civil War, seen things that still visited him in dreams, and with the quiet authority of someone who had survived worse than anything these mountains could throw at him, he carried himself. Until James Pritchard disappeared. Strong as an ox was 19-year-old James, and eager to prove himself. As a logger he worked, cutting timber on the northern slopes, where thick and tall grew the old pines. On the morning of September 14th, before dawn he left his family's cabin, heading out with his axe and his lunch pail, following the trail that would take him to the worksite. He never arrived. By afternoon, his father, William Pritchard, was walking the trail, calling his son's name. By evening, with torches and lanterns, half a dozen men were searching. Beside the trail near a small creek where the path crossed Whitford land, they found his axe. His lunch pail was there too, unopened, music, but of James, there was no sign. Search parties were organized by Sheriff Granger. For 3 days, men combed the forest, following every game trail, checking every ravine and hollow. They found nothing. No body, no blood, no trace of violence. As if James had simply stepped off the path and vanished into the trees, it was. Maybe he ran off, someone suggested at the general store. Young men do that. Head west. Look for opportunity. But William Pritchard shook his head, his face grey with sleeplessness and grief. Not James. Without a word, he wouldn't leave. Something happened to him. Though he kept his theories to himself, Sheriff Granger agreed. In his experience, when a man disappeared in the mountains, it usually meant an accident, a fall, a rock slide, a sudden illness. But the way James's belongings were arranged bothered him. Carefully against a tree leaned the axe. Neatly on a flat rock sat the pail. It didn't look like someone who had stumbled and fallen. It looked like someone who had set down his things and walked away. But why and where? Through October, the investigation dragged on. Thin and haunted grew William Pritchard, spending his days walking the same trails searching for his son. At night, the other families kept their doors locked, though exactly what they were afraid of, no one could say. Then on November 3rd, it happened again. A hunter was Ezra Coleman, 56 years old, with 30 years of experience tracking deer, bear, and elk through these mountains. Like the lines on his own hands, he knew the land. Before dawn he left to check his trap lines on the eastern ridge, a route that would take him past the Whitford property. He never came home. By midday, his wife Martha raised the alarm. As he gathered another search party, Sheriff Granger felt his stomach tighten. They found Ezra's rifle propped against music, a tree, still sheathed on his belt his hunting knife, lying in the grass near the same creek where James Pritchard's axe had been found. This time there was something else. Into the bark of a nearby oak tree, someone had carved a symbol, a circular pattern with lines radiating outward like a crude sun or star. Fresh were the cuts, made within the last day or two. For a long time, Sheriff Granger stared at the symbol, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the November wind. He had seen markings like this before, though he couldn't quite remember where, something from his childhood perhaps, or stories his grandmother had told about the old ways, the beliefs that some of the earliest settlers had brought from Scotland and Ireland. Beliefs that were supposed to have died out generations ago. "What do you make of it, Sheriff?" asked Deputy Harlan Wade, a young man of 25 with more enthusiasm than experience. Over the rough cuts, Granger reached out and touched the carving, running his fingers. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but I intend to find out." To the Whitford cabin, he rode that evening. As he approached, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. From the chimney rose smoke, a rare sight, and something cooking he could smell, though strange was the scent, almost medicinal. He dismounted and tied his horse to the fence, then walked to the door and knocked. For a long moment, music, there was no response. Then the door opened a crack and Abigail Whitford looked out at him. In the fading light, her face was pale, her dark hair pulled back severely from her face. "Sheriff," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "Miss Whitford, I apologize for disturbing you so late, but some questions I need to ask you and your sister." "About what?" "About the men who've gone missing. Near your property, 2 of them disappeared. I'm talking to everyone in the area." Didn't change Abigail's expression. "We haven't seen anyone. Not even passing by." James Pritchard was heading to the logging site. Ezra Coleman was checking his traps. "Both routes pass near here. We keep to ourselves, Sheriff. We don't watch the trails." Behind her, Sheriff Granger could see Ruth moving in the shadows of the cabin's interior, her figure barely visible in the dim firelight. Carefully Granger said, "I understand. But if you do see anything unusual, anyone who doesn't belong, strange tracks, anything at all, immediately I need you to report it." Of course, Abigail began to close the door. "One more thing," Granger said quickly. "Do you know what this symbol means?" He sketched the circular pattern he'd seen carved into the tree. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered in Abigail's eyes. Recognition perhaps, or fear, but it passed so quickly that Granger couldn't be sure he'd seen it at all. "No," she said. "I don't know what that is." The door closed, and standing in the gathering darkness was left Sheriff Granger, more troubled than when he'd arrived. As he rode back toward town, he couldn't shake the feeling that from the cabin's small windows, he was being watched. And when he glanced back over his shoulder, in those windows he saw the glow of firelight flickering, casting shadows that moved in ways that didn't quite match human shapes. He touched the pistol at his hip and urged his horse to move faster. In the cabin behind him, Abigail turned away from the door and looked at Ruth. Beside the fireplace stood her younger sister, her hands trembling. "He knows something," Ruth whispered. "He suspects," Abigail corrected. "That's different. As long as we're careful, there's nothing he can prove. But if he comes back, then what needs to be done, we'll do." To the fireplace walked Abigail and stirred the pot that hung over the flames. Thick and savory was the smell that rose from it, but with an undertone that would have turned a stranger's stomach. The ritual must continue. Mother made that clear. If we stop now, for nothing will have been everything she sacrificed. Slowly Ruth nodded, though her face was tight with fear. "How much longer?" "Until it's complete." Some of the stew Abigail ladled into a wooden bowl and handed it to her sister. "Until we've taken enough life to balance what was lost, until we're strong enough that nothing can hurt us again." In silence they ate. Their shadows large against the cabin walls the fire cast, while outside through the trees howled the November wind, and began to fall the first snow of winter. By mid-November, Red Hollow had changed. The easy trust that had defined life in the isolated community had evaporated, replaced by suspicion and fear. Families that once left their doors unlocked now barricaded them at night. Close to home were children kept. The trading post, usually a place of gossip and small talk, fell into uneasy silence whenever someone mentioned the missing men. 2 disappearances could be explained away as tragic accidents or bad luck. But something darker at work the community sensed, even if no one could name it. Since his visit to the Whitford cabin, Sheriff Thomas Granger had barely slept. His days he spent reviewing everything he knew about the missing men, looking for connections he might have missed. At night, he pored over old records in the small office attached to his home, searching for similar cases, any historical precedent that might shed light on what, music, was happening. In the official records, he found nothing. But in the margins of an old county ledger from 1872, written in faded pencil, he discovered a note. 3 hunters lost near Whitford land. No bodies recovered. Investigation abandoned. To Sheriff Marcus Duggan belonged the handwriting, Granger's predecessor, who had died of pneumonia in 1885. About these cases, Granger had never heard. They weren't in any of the formal reports he'd inherited. Why had Duggan hidden this information? On November 18th, in Red Hollow arrived a traveling merchant named Samuel Hicks. A heavyset man in his 40s was he, who made his living moving between mountain communities, selling goods that couldn't be obtained locally: fine cloth, quality knives, medicines, and luxuries like coffee and sugar. 2 nights Samuel planned to stay, conducting business from his wagon parked outside the trading post. Friendly and talkative he was, exchanging news from other settlements, and as a break from the isolation of mountain life, several families looked forward to his visits. On the morning of November 19th, Samuel loaded his wagon and prepared to leave, heading south toward the next community on his route. Past the Whitford property would take him the trail, following the creek for several miles before climbing over the ridge. As the wagon rolled out of sight around the bend in the road, Deputy Harlan Wade watched him leave, waving. Samuel Hicks never reached his destination. By November 21st, when he failed to arrive at the settlement of Pine Creek, only 8 miles south, with questions the sheriff there sent a rider to Red Hollow. Had Samuel Hicks left as planned? Had there been any trouble? As he read the message, Sheriff Granger felt his blood run cold. Immediately he organized a search party, and this time he brought 12 men, all armed, all experienced in the woods. Samuel's wagon they found 2 miles south of Red Hollow, just beyond where the trail passed closest to the Whitford cabin. In their traces were the horses still, calmly grazing on the grass beside the road. Intact was the wagon, its contents undisturbed, except for one thing. Gone was Samuel Hicks. But this time there was more evidence. Barely visible in the carpet of fallen leaves, leading away from the wagon, was a trail of disturbed earth, as if something heavy had been dragged. Slowly, their rifles ready, Sheriff Granger and his men followed it into the forest. Toward the Whitford property wound the drag marks through the trees for nearly a quarter mile before disappearing near a dense thicket of mountain laurel. And carved into the trees along the path were more symbols, the same circular patterns they'd seen before, but also others. Spirals, crossed lines, shapes that resembled crude hands or wings. "What in God's name is this?" whispered one of the men, a farmer named Douglas Kerr. "Something old," Granger said quietly, though he didn't elaborate. He was beginning to remember where he'd seen symbols like these before, in his grandmother's cottage in the Highlands of Scotland, where she'd lived before immigrating as a young woman. A small leather journal filled with drawings and notes written in Gaelic she had kept, most of which he'd never been able to read. But the symbols he remembered, and the way she'd hidden the book whenever the minister came to visit. "These aren't Christian markings," said another man, Calvin Price, who served as the community's lay preacher. Pale had gone his face. "These are something else. Something from before." "Before what?" asked Deputy Wade. "Before the church. Before civilization." The symbol on the nearest tree Price touched, then jerked his hand back as if burned. "About the old practices my grandfather told stories, blood rituals, sacrifices, ways of gaining power that God never intended for men to know." Through the group rippled a murmur of unease. "We need to search the Whitford property," Granger said firmly. "Now." But even as he said it, a deep reluctance he felt, a primal instinct, music, warning him that what they would find there would change everything. In the late afternoon they approached the cabin, the sun already sinking behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and purple. More foreboding than Granger remembered looked the building. Dark and blank were the windows, the chimney producing a thin stream of smoke that seemed to hang in the air rather than dissipate. Harder this time Granger knocked on the door, with authority. "Abigail Whitford. Ruth Whitford. This is Sheriff Granger. Open the door. We need to speak with you." Silence. Again he knocked, louder. "Miss Whitford, I have a dozen men with me. We're going to search your property in connection with the disappearances. You can cooperate or we can break down this door. Your choice." More silence. Then finally, the sound of a bolt sliding back. The door opened and there stood Abigail, her face expressionless, but her eyes glittering with something dark and defiant. A simple dress she wore stained with what looked like old blood or rust, and rough and calloused were her hands. "You have no right to be here," she said coldly. "Every right I have. 3 men are missing and all of them were last seen near your property. Your cabin and your land I'm going to search, and you're going to let me do it. We've done nothing wrong. Then you have nothing to hide." Past her into the cabin pushed Granger and his men followed, though several of them hesitated at the threshold as if crossing some invisible line they shouldn't. Dim and cold was the interior of the cabin despite the fire. Sparse were the furnishings, a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, a pair of narrow beds along one wall. From the rafters hung herbs and roots, filling the air with a pungent medicinal smell that couldn't quite mask another odor beneath it, something organic and unsettling. In the corner near the fireplace stood Ruth, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. Like she wanted to speak she looked but couldn't find the words. "Check everything," Granger ordered. "The beds, the cupboards, under the floorboards. And someone check that root cellar I saw outside." The men spread out, searching methodically, but with visible discomfort. About this place was something that set their nerves on edge. A wrongness that went beyond the mere fact of the investigation. A cabinet Deputy Wade opened and found jars filled with preserved meat, dried herbs, and strange powders. A loose floorboard Douglas Kerr pulled up and discovered a wooden box containing old papers, and what looked like personal effects: a woman's brooch, a man's pipe, a child's toy. "Sheriff," called one of the men from outside. "You need to see this." Into the yard stepped Granger and followed the man, a hunter named Jacob Mills, around to the back of the cabin where a slanted wooden door led down into the root cellar. Open stood the door, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. "I opened it," Jacob said, his voice shaking slightly. "But I don't want to go down there." From one of the men, Granger took a lantern and lit it. As he held it up, the flame flickered, casting long shadows across the entrance to the cellar. "Wait here," he said, and started down the steps. As he descended, colder grew the air, and stronger grew the smell he'd noticed in the cabin, a mix of decay and something chemical, almost like lye or wood ash. Larger than he'd expected was the cellar, carved out of the earth and reinforced with stone walls. As his eyes adjusted to the lantern light, he began to make out shapes in the darkness. Into something that was part workshop, part shrine had been converted the cellar. Along one wall, crude shelves held jars and bottles, some containing liquids, others filled with what looked like dried meat or preserved organs. From hooks hung tools, knives of various sizes, saws, cleavers, all meticulously cleaned, but showing signs of heavy use. In the center of the room stood a wooden table, scarred and stained, dark with old blood. Beside it, over a cold fire pit, sat a large iron pot. But the far wall was what made Granger's blood run cold. Directly into the stone were carved dozens of symbols, the same patterns he'd seen on the trees, but more elaborate, more detailed. A kind of border they formed around a central image, a crude representation of two female figures standing before what might have been flames or a sun, their arms raised, their mouths open. And at the base of the wall, arranged in a neat row, were bones, not animal bones, human bones. Femurs, ribs, a skull that had been carefully cleaned and arranged as if for display. Frozen stood Granger, the lantern trembling in his hand. Death he had seen before, on battlefields, in accidents, from disease. But this was different. This was deliberate. This was ritual. He forced himself to move closer, to examine the scene with the trained eye of a lawman. Old were the bones, he could tell. Months at least, perhaps years. But there were fresher signs, too. On the table were blood stains that hadn't completely faded. In the fire pit were ashes that still held warmth. On the shelves, among the jars, he found something that made his stomach turn. A collection of personal items, a leather wallet, a pocket watch, a silver ring, items that might have belonged to the missing men. "Sweet God in heaven," he whispered. Behind him on the stairs he heard footsteps and turned to see Deputy Wade descending, his face pale in the lantern light. "Sheriff, the men are asking what," mid-sentence Wade stopped as he saw the cellar. Open fell his mouth. What is this?" "Evidence," Granger said, his voice hard. "Evidence of murder. Maybe more than murder. Should we bring the women down here? Make them explain?" Slowly Granger shook his head. "No, we're taking them into custody, both of them. And we're sending for the county marshal. This is beyond what we can handle here." Back up the stairs they climbed into the fading daylight. Around gathered the men, their faces expectant and fearful. "Enough we found," Granger said simply. "Abigail Whitford, Ruth Whitford, you are under arrest for suspected involvement in the disappearances and deaths of James Pritchard, Ezra Coleman, and Samuel Hicks." Near the cabin door, standing with her arms crossed, Abigail didn't move. "Nothing you found," she said calmly. "Bones. This is mountain country, Sheriff. Animals die here all the time. Hunters leave remains. Those aren't animal bones, and you know it. Prove it." Cold were her eyes, challenging. "Prove they're human. Prove they belong to anyone who went missing." "You can't." Right she was, Granger realized with frustration. Without a proper medical examiner or forensic expert, which they didn't have in Red Hollow, definitively prove what he knew in his gut to be true, he couldn't. But the guilt in Ruth's face he could see. Trembling stood the younger sister, tears streaming down her cheeks, as if in prayer, her hands clutched together. "Ruth," gently Granger said, stepping toward her, "if you know something, now is the time to speak. If your sister made you do things you didn't want to do, if you were afraid, we can help you, But the truth you have to tell us. Ruth's mouth opened, and for a moment, Granger thought she would confess. But then Abigail spoke, her voice sharp and commanding. Ruth, say nothing. And just like that, passed the moment. Ruth's mouth closed, and to the ground she lowered her eyes, silent once more. Take them both, Granger ordered. We'll hold them in the jail until the marshal arrives. With rope to bind the sisters' hands, two of the men moved forward. Without resistance submitted Abigail, her face calm and unreadable. But as they led her away from the cabin, she turned and looked back at the building, and Granger could have sworn her lips moving he saw, forming words without sound. Quietly went Ruth, crying softly, but not speaking. As the group began the march back toward town, Granger ordered Jacob Mills and Calvin Price to stay behind and guard the cabin until he could arrange for a proper search of the entire property. Don't go back in the cellar, he warned them. Don't touch anything. Just watch the building and make sure no one disturbs the evidence. The two men nodded, though they looked distinctly unhappy about being left behind in the gathering darkness. 2 hours took the journey back to Red Hollow, the trail difficult in the fading light. By the time they reached the small jail, really just a converted shed attached to Granger's office, full night had fallen. In separate cells they locked the sisters. On the narrow cot sat Abigail with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the wall. In the corner of her cell curled up Ruth, her face turned away, with silent sobs, her shoulders shaking. We'll take turns watching them through the night, Granger told Deputy Wade. You take the first shift. I need to write reports and send for the marshal. Sheriff, quietly Wade said, glancing toward the cells. What do you think they were doing in that cellar? His deputy's eyes Granger met. I think they were following something their mother taught them. Something old and evil that should have stayed, music, buried. But why? Why would anyone? Fear, interrupted Granger, or madness. Or maybe they truly believed it would give them power over death, over fate. Terrible things people do when they're desperate, or when they've been taught that darkness is the only way to survive. He paused, then added more quietly. Or maybe they're just evil. Some people are. Slowly Wade nodded, music, his young face troubled. In the chair facing the cells he sat down, his rifle across his lap. Into his office went Granger and lit the lamp on his desk. Paper and pen he pulled out and began to write, documenting everything they'd found, everything he suspected. As he wrote, from the cells he could hear Ruth's quiet crying. And once he heard Abigail's voice, low and rhythmic, as if she were chanting or praying in a language he didn't recognize. Outside picked up the wind, rattling the windows. Again had begun to fall snow, heavier now, and by morning the trails would be difficult to pass, Granger knew. Days it might be before the marshal could reach them, days alone with whatever darkness lived in those two women. He kept writing, filling page after page, determined to document the truth before anything else could happen, because deep in his bones he felt certain that far from over was the story of the Whitford sisters. In her cell, finally Abigail stopped chanting and lay down on the cot. Open remained her eyes, staring at the ceiling, and at the corners of her mouth played a small smile. Exactly as it needed to was proceeding everything. Steadily through the night fell the snow, blanketing Red Hollow in silence. By dawn, under 6 inches of fresh powder had disappeared the paths between buildings, and below freezing had dropped the temperature. Had not slept Sheriff Granger. The dark hours he'd spent organizing the evidence, writing reports, and preparing questions for the interrogations he knew would come with daylight. At first light, on the office door knocked Deputy Wade, his face drawn with exhaustion from the night watch. Anything happened? Granger asked. The older one, Abigail. She talked to herself most of the night, couldn't understand the words. The younger one, Ruth, she cried for about an hour, then went quiet. Hasn't made a sound since midnight. Did they eat the food we brought them? Abigail did. Ruth wouldn't touch it. Grimly Granger nodded. Enough suspects in custody he had seen to recognize the pattern. Composed was Abigail, in control, likely the dominant personality. The weaker link was Ruth, consumed by guilt or fear. If he was going to get a confession, from Ruth it would come. Get some rest, he told Wade. I'm going to talk to them separately. Send word to the families of the missing men that we've made arrests, but don't give them any details yet. And find out if anyone in town knows about the symbols we saw carved into the trees and walls. Left Wade, and another cup of coffee poured Granger, his fifth of the night. Little did the bitter liquid to clear the fog in his mind, but it kept him alert. His notes he gathered and walked into the cell area. Weak and grey was the morning light coming through the small window, making the cramped space feel like a tomb. On her cot sat Ruth with her knees drawn up to her chest, her face buried in her arms. Smaller than she had yesterday she looked, diminished somehow. At the bars of her cell stood Abigail, her hands wrapped around the cold iron, watching him approach with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Good morning, Sheriff," Abigail said, her voice calm and almost pleasant. "Have you come to apologize for this unlawful imprisonment?" Ignored her Granger and stopped in front of Ruth's cell. "Miss Whitford," gently he said, "I'd like to talk with you alone." Slightly Ruth lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen. Toward her sister's cell she glanced, then quickly looked away. "Ruth doesn't want to talk to you," sharply Abigail said. "She has nothing to say." "I'm asking her, not you," kept his gaze on Ruth Granger. "Will you come with me? I'll have some food brought. We can sit in my office where it's warmer." For a long moment, didn't move Ruth. Then slowly she unfolded herself from the cot and stood. From cold or fear or both, she was trembling. "Ruth, don't," said Abigail, her voice low and threatening. "Remember what Mother told us. Silence is strength. Words are weapons they'll use against us." But already moving toward the cell door was Ruth, her eyes fixed on the floor. It unlocked Granger and gently guided her toward the office, closing the connecting door behind them to muffle Abigail's protests. Beside the stove he settled Ruth where the heat would warm her, and for her poured a cup of coffee. Around the mug she wrapped her hands, but didn't drink, just stared into the dark liquid, as if searching for answers in its depths. Across from her sat Granger, adopting the patient, non-threatening posture he'd learned was most effective with frightened witnesses. "Ruth," softly he said, "I know you're scared. I know this situation feels impossible, but I need you to understand something. What we found in that cellar is evidence of serious crimes. People are dead. Their families deserve to know what happened to them." Trembled Ruth's hands, making the coffee ripple in the mug. "If you were forced to participate in something against your will," Granger continued. "If your sister made you do things you didn't want to do, that changes everything. I can help you, but only if you tell me the truth." Down Ruth's cheek rolled a tear, then another. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely a whisper. "You don't understand. Then help me understand. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Mother said it was the only way. She said if we didn't continue the rituals, we would die. We would lose everything, just like she lost Father." Slightly Granger leaned forward. "What rituals, Ruth? What exactly were you doing?" Faster came Ruth's breath, her chest rising and falling with barely controlled panic. "The consumption ritual. It's old. So old. Mother learned it from her mother who learned it from hers. It goes back to the old country, to the times before churches, before laws. Times when people had to be strong to survive. Tell me about the men who disappeared. James Pritchard, Ezra Coleman, Samuel Hicks. What happened to them?" Closed her eyes Ruth, tears streaming down her face. "They came. They walked the trails near our land. Abigail said they were gifts that the forest provided them for us. She said if we didn't take them, we were spitting on Mother's sacrifice. So, you killed them." "Not me," quickly said Ruth, her eyes flying open. I couldn't. Abigail did it. She's stronger. She believes in it completely. I helped after. I helped with the preparations, the rituals, because if I didn't, Abigail said the magic would fail and we'd both die." "What did the rituals involve, Ruth?" Shuddered she, her face going pale. "Consumption. Of flesh, of blood. Mother taught us that by taking in the life force of others, we could extend our own lives, protect ourselves from illness and harm. She said it was how she survived after Father died in the fire. She said it was how we would survive too. Granger felt his stomach, but he kept his expression neutral. How many, Ruth? How many have there been? I don't know, she whispered. Before James, there were others. Years ago. When we were younger, Mother did it then. We just watched. But after Mother died 3 years ago, Abigail said it was our responsibility to continue. That if we stopped everything would fall apart. Your mother died 3 years ago. How? Crumbled Ruth's face. She got sick. A fever that wouldn't break. She lasted 2 weeks, getting weaker every day. Near the end, she made us swear on Father's memory that we would continue the rituals. She said if we didn't, the protection would fade and we'd meet the same fate as Father, burning alive, consumed by fire that couldn't be stopped. And you believed her. What choice did we have? Slightly rose Ruth's voice, desperate now. We were alone. We had no one. Mother was all we knew. Everything she taught us, everything she believed, it was our whole world. When she died, Abigail said we had to be strong, had to honor Mother's teachings. I was too scared to argue. Back sat Granger, processing the confession. A picture it painted of 2 young women, isolated and traumatized, raised by a mother who had taught them that survival required monstrous acts. It didn't excuse what they'd done, but it provided context, a glimpse into how normal people could be twisted into committing unspeakable crimes. Ruth, I need you to tell me exactly what happened to the 3 men who went missing this fall. Start with James Pritchard. Now shook Ruth's whole body. She sat down the coffee mug before she dropped it. James, he came past our property in the early morning. Abigail saw him from the window. She said the timing was perfect, that Mother's spirit had guided him to us. She told me to stay inside while she went out. What did she do? She called to him, asked if he needed water, if he wanted to rest. James was kind. He stopped. He came to the fence to talk to her. Broke Ruth's voice, and then, Abigail struck him from behind with a piece of firewood. He fell and she dragged him into the trees before anyone could see. Was he dead? Not yet. She brought him to the cellar. She said the ritual required the victim to be alive when the consumption began, that the life force had to be fresh to provide power. With her hands covered her face, Ruth, sobbing. I heard him down there. Heard him begging, but I was too afraid to help him. Too afraid of Abigail. Too afraid of breaking Mother's rules. A cold fury building in his chest felt Granger, but he forced himself to remain calm. And the others? Ezra Coleman and Samuel Hicks. The same. Ezra came past checking his traps. Samuel stopped his wagon to rest his horses. Abigail lured them both, struck them, brought them to the cellar. Each time she said the ritual was working, that we were becoming stronger, more protected. But I didn't feel stronger. With haunted eyes looked up at him, Ruth. I just felt hollow, empty, like something inside me was dying with each person we took. Ruth, I need you to put all of this in writing. A full confession. If you cooperate, if you testify against your sister, the judge might show leniency. You were coerced, manipulated by your mother and sister. That matters. Weakly Ruth nodded. Will they hang us? Didn't answer Granger. The truth was he didn't know. What the Whitford sisters had done was beyond anything the local courts had ever handled. To a higher authority would likely defer the county judge, possibly even state or federal jurisdiction given the extreme nature of the crimes. Let's focus on the truth first, he said. Write down everything you remember. Don't leave anything out. For her he provided paper and pen, and for the next 2 hours, wrote Ruth, her handwriting shaky but legible, and page after page she filled with details that made Granger's skin crawl, descriptions of the rituals, the tools used, the way Abigail had divided the bodies, preserving some parts and disposing of others in the deep woods where they'd never be found. When she finally finished, cramping were her hands, and with exhaustion and trauma glazed were her eyes. The pages took Granger, carefully read through them to ensure they were complete. Then had Ruth sign each one. Thank you, quietly he said. I know that wasn't easy. Will you keep me away from Abigail? Asked Ruth, her voice small and frightened. She'll be so angry when she finds out I told you everything. You'll be in separate cells. I won't let her near you. As he led Ruth back to the cells, at the bars was waiting Abigail, her face twisted with rage. Somehow, she seemed to know what had happened. "You weak, pathetic fool," she hissed at Ruth as they passed. "Mother would be ashamed. You've betrayed everything we are, everything we were meant to become." Flinched Ruth, but said nothing, retreating to her cot and turning her face to the wall. Her cell locked Granger, then turned to face Abigail. "Your sister just gave me a full confession. Everything about the rituals, the murders, your mother's teachings. It's over, Abigail." Didn't change Abigail's expression. If anything, almost amused she looked. "Is it? You think you understand what we've done, but you don't. You think this is about murder, about crimes that can be judged by your laws. But you're wrong, Sheriff. This is about survival. This is about power that goes deeper than anything your courts can touch. You killed 3 innocent men in cold blood. You butchered them in rituals based on insane beliefs taught by a disturbed woman. There's nothing powerful about that. It's just evil." "Evil?" laughed Abigail, a sound without warmth. "Your religion, your laws, they're the real evil. They force people to be weak, to accept suffering and death as inevitable. My mother discovered another way, an older way. And yes, it requires sacrifices, but what great power doesn't? You're mad. Am I? Or am I just honest about what it takes to survive in a world that wants to crush us?" Closer to the bars leaned Abigail, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You found the bones in the cellar, Sheriff. Did you count them? There were more than 3 men's worth. Much more. This didn't start with James Pritchard. It's been happening for years, decades, and no one ever stopped us because no one ever knew. We were careful. We were patient. Until now." Ice in his veins felt Granger. "How many?" "Enough." Coldly smiled Abigail. "Enough to keep us alive through winters that should have killed us. Enough to protect us from diseases that ravaged other families. Enough to prove that Mother was right about everything. You're going to hang for this, both of you. Maybe. Or maybe the rituals will protect us even now. Maybe your rope will break. Your scaffold will collapse. Mother always said that those who follow the old ways are watched over by forces older than your God." Away turned Granger, disgusted and disturbed. Any more of Abigail's delusions he couldn't listen to. Back in his office, he sent Deputy Wade to spread the word. In custody were both Whitford sisters, and to multiple murders had confessed Ruth. An urgent message to the county marshal he wrote explaining the situation and requesting immediate assistance. But even as he went through the motions of proper procedure, to something Abigail had said kept returning a part of his mind. This has been happening for decades. How far back did this horror go? And how many victims had been lost to the Whitford family's twisted rituals before anyone had noticed? The old ledger again he pulled out, the one with Sheriff Duggan's hidden note about the 3 missing hunters in 1872. Through older records he began searching, looking for patterns, for disappearances that might have been dismissed as accidents or men who had simply moved on. What he found chilled him to the bone. Going back nearly 20 years, there were references, vague, often incomplete, to people who had vanished near what was then called the Whitford homestead, a trapper in 1873, 2 loggers in 1875, a traveling preacher in 1878, a young couple in 1882. None of the cases had been thoroughly investigated. Most had been written off as people who had left town or met with accidents in the unforgiving mountains. But now, with Ruth's confession and the evidence in the cellar, a different picture emerged. For at least 2 decades, possibly longer, had been preying on travelers and isolated individuals. The Whitford family, first Maeve and Silas, then Maeve alone after the fire, and finally Abigail and Ruth. And blind to it had been the entire community, protected by isolation, by the assumption that bad things sometimes just happened in the mountains, and by the Whitfords' careful selection of victims, people who wouldn't be missed, who had no deep ties to Red Hollow. By midday, through the settlement had spread word, and outside the sheriff's office began gathering people. Answers they wanted. Wanted to know if it was truly over. If the nightmare that had gripped their community was finally ended. From the porch addressed them Granger, explaining what they'd found, what Ruth had confessed, and what would happen next. Shock, horror, and anger in their faces he saw, but also relief. The monster had been caught. The mystery solved. But as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that still wrong was something, that some piece of the puzzle remained hidden. That night, as the temperature dropped even further and continued to fall the snow, alone kept watch over the cell's Sheriff Thomas Granger, unwilling to let anyone else bear the burden of guarding the Whitford sisters. And in the darkness, lo, he heard Abigail singing, rhythmic verses in a language that sounded like nothing he'd ever heard, words that seemed to make the shadows in the cell area move in ways they shouldn't. Just exhaustion, he told himself it was, just his mind playing tricks after days without sleep. But deep down, sure he wasn't that he believed that. 3 days after the arrests, finally arrived in Red Hollow the county marshal. Marshal Theodore Brennan was a tall, weathered man in his 50s, with iron-grey hair and the bearing of someone who had seen too much of humanity's dark side to be easily shocked. With him he brought 2 deputies and a doctor from the county seat, who had some training in examining remains. At the edge of town met them Sheriff Granger, exhausted but relieved to finally have help. On everything they'd found he briefed Marshal Brennan, everything Ruth had confessed, and the disturbing implications of how long the Whitford family's crimes might have gone undetected. 20 years, quietly said Brennan, shaking his head. Maybe more. Christ, how does something like this go on for so long without anyone noticing? Isolation, replied Granger. Distance. And victims who were chosen carefully, people passing through, people who wouldn't be missed immediately. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, the trail was cold. And the mother, Maeve Whitford, she started this. According to Ruth, Maeve learned these practices from her own mother in Scotland, some kind of ancient ritual belief system that predates Christianity. They believed consuming human flesh in ritualistic ways would grant them protection, longevity, power over death and disease. Grim was Brennan's expression. I've heard of similar practices, folklore from the old world, mostly stories about Highland clans that practiced music, cannibalism during times of famine, or Celtic tribes that believed consuming enemies would transfer their strength. But I never thought I'd encounter someone who actually believed it enough to act on it. Together they walked to the jail where Brennan and his men could begin their formal investigation. The doctor, a thin, scholarly man named Whitmore, went immediately to examine the cellar, while separately interviewed Ruth and Abigail Brennan. Emotional and painful was Ruth's interview. Everything she'd told Granger she repeated, filling in additional details about specific victims, dates, and methods. Throughout she wept, her guilt and trauma evident in every word. Notes took Dr. Whitmore, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the anatomical aspects of what had been done to the victims. Entirely different was Abigail's interview. Calmly she sat, answering questions with cold precision, showing no remorse whatsoever. She confirmed that for decades the rituals had been ongoing, that from childhood her mother had taught her and Ruth, that this was their heritage, their duty, their path to survival. "Do you feel any guilt for what you've done?" directly asked Brennan her. Without flinching met his gaze Abigail. "Do you feel guilt when you eat a chicken, Marshal? When you slaughter a pig? We all consume life to sustain our own. The only difference is what kind of life and what purpose it serves. Human beings are not livestock. Aren't they?" Back in her chair leaned Abigail, her expression thoughtful. "What makes one life more valuable than another? Your laws. Your God. I was taught different laws by older gods. Laws that say survival is sacred and anything done in service of survival is justified. You're going to hang for this philosophy. Perhaps. But I'll die knowing I followed the true path. Can you say the same?" Ended the interview Brennan, disturbed by Abigail's complete lack of remorse or sanity. She wasn't just defending her actions, she genuinely believed she had done nothing wrong, that she had been following a higher calling. 2 days spent Dr. Whitmore examining the cellar and the remains found there. Thorough and damning was his report. He identified bone fragments from at least 7 different individuals, including marks consistent with butchering, evidence of fire used to cook flesh, and tools that had been specifically modified for the purpose of dismembering human bodies. This wasn't random violence, to the assembled lawmen, explained Whitmore. This was systematic, ritualistic, and planned. An entire process for what they were doing had created the Whitfords' capture, killing, preparation, consumption, and disposal. One of the most disturbing things I've ever documented it is. Search parties organized Marshall Brennan to comb the woods around the Whitford property for more evidence. Over the next week, they found several shallow graves containing skeletal remains, personal effects that helped identify some of the victims, and more of the strange symbols carved into trees in hidden clearings. As the investigation continued, clear became the true scope of the horror. Based on Ruth's testimony, the physical evidence, and old missing persons reports that Sheriff Granger had dug up, they estimated that at least 15 people over a 20-year period, possibly more, had killed and cannibalized the Whitford family. Devastated was the community of Red Hollow. People they had known had been many of the victims, neighbors who had disappeared years ago and been assumed to have moved away, travelers who had been forgotten, workers who had been thought to have quit and left the area. When he learned what had happened to his son, in Sheriff Granger's office stood William Pritchard, father of the first victim James, and wept. How? Through his tears he asked. How do people become capable of such things? That would provide comfort had no answer Granger. The truth was that by their upbringing had been shaped Abigail and Ruth, molded by a mother who had passed down twisted beliefs and isolated in a way that allowed those beliefs to flourish without challenge. But that didn't change what they had done. Didn't bring back the dead. Didn't ease the grief of the families who now knew the terrible truth. For early December in the county courthouse 30 miles south of Red Hollow was scheduled the trial. Multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and desecration of human remains would face both sisters. In the days leading up to the trial, deeper into despair sank Ruth. Almost entirely she stopped eating, spoke to no one, and on her cot curled up spent her time, staring at nothing. Her examined Dr. Whitmore and declared that from severe melancholia and psychological trauma she was suffering. She's coming to terms with what she's done, to Granger he explained. Her mind can't reconcile the person she thought she was with the reality of her actions. It's possible she may not survive to stand trial, not from physical illness, but from sheer psychological collapse. By contrast, Abigail remained strong and defiant. Well, she ate, soundly slept, and her days spent singing those strange songs in the unknown language, occasionally calling out to Ruth in attempts to either comfort or condemn her. Couldn't tell which Granger. On December 2nd, the day before they were scheduled to transport the sisters to the county seat for trial, something happened that changed everything. In his office working was Sheriff Granger reviewing documents when from the cells he heard a commotion. He rushed in to find in front of Ruth's cell standing Deputy Wade, his face pale with shock. From the bars of the small window in her cell was hanging Ruth, a rope made from torn strips of her dress wrapped around her neck. Blue was her face, open and staring her eyes, slightly still swinging her body from the motion of her final moments. "Oh God," breathed Granger. "How long?" "I just found her," stammered Wade. "I checked on them 20 minutes ago and on her cot lying she was. I thought she was sleeping. When I came back, immediately they cut her down, but far too late it was. Dead was Ruth Whitford, having taken her own life rather than face trial and execution for her crimes." In the adjacent cell, at the bars stood Abigail, watching the scene with an expression that might have been satisfaction or sadness. "Impossible to tell it was. Always weak she was," quietly said Abigail. "Mother knew it. That's why she made me promise to keep Ruth strong, to guide her, to ensure she followed the path. But I failed. Ruth never truly believed. She never understood that what we did was necessary, was holy." "Shut up," harshly said Granger, more shaken than he wanted to admit. "Don't speak about your sister. Don't speak at all. Free now she is," continued Abigail, ignoring him. "Free from doubt, from guilt, from the weight of choice. In a way, I envy her." With a sheet they covered Ruth's body and sent for the doctor. Officially, music, recorded would have to be the death, investigated to ensure it was truly suicide, and not somehow facilitated by Abigail. But Dr. Whitmore's examination confirmed what they already knew. Over several days, from her dress had torn strips Ruth, hidden them in her bedding, and carefully braided them into a rope strong enough to support her weight. For a moment when the guard's attention was elsewhere she had waited, climbed onto her cot, through the bars of the small window threaded the rope, and jumped. "This she planned," said Whitmore. This wasn't an impulsive act. She knew what she was doing and when she would do it. Through Red Hollow like wildfire spread the news of Ruth's suicide. Cheated of justice felt some, angry that she had escaped punishment for her crimes. A strange sort of pity felt others, seeing her death as the final tragedy in a life that had been warped and broken from childhood. With only Abigail as defendant went forward the trial. Before the judge she stood, calm and composed as the charges were read. 15 counts of murder, conspiracy, and various other crimes related to the desecration and consumption of human remains. Into evidence was entered Ruth's written confession along with Dr. Whitmore's examination results, the physical evidence from the cellar, and testimony from Sheriff Granger, Marshal Brennan, and several residents of Red Hollow who could speak to the disappearances and the Whitfords' isolated behavior. No defense offered Abigail. When asked if she wished to speak in her own behalf, she stood and addressed the court in that same calm, unsettling tone she had used throughout her imprisonment. "Guilty of everything you accuse me of, I am," clearly she said. "But guilty of any crime against nature or morality, I am not. The teachings of my ancestors I followed, the wisdom passed down through generations, the rituals that kept my family alive when everything else tried to destroy us. If for choosing survival your laws condemn me, for honoring the old ways, then unjust are your laws. No regrets I have. I would do it all again." In shocked murmurs erupted the courtroom. For silence pounded the judge, his face stern and disgusted. For less than an hour deliberated the jury before returning a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Immediately came sentencing. Death by hanging to be carried out within 30 days. Without reaction received the sentence Abigail, her face as composed as if she'd been told what the weather would be tomorrow. As she was led from the courtroom, she turned and looked directly at Sheriff Granger, who sat in the gallery. Something he couldn't quite identify held her eyes. Not quite triumph, not quite defeat, just a deep, dark certainty that somehow, in some way he didn't understand, one she had. For December 28, 1891, was scheduled the hanging. In the county seat was to take place the execution, but to witness it demanded the people of Red Hollow. Closure they wanted to see with their own eyes that truly over was the nightmare. And so, unusual though it was, arrangements were made for the hanging to occur in Red Hollow itself, in a clearing near the center of the settlement, where such grim business could be conducted in full view of those who had been affected by the Whitfords' crimes. In the week leading up to the execution was built the scaffold. A simple but sturdy structure of fresh-cut timber with a platform, steps, and the crossbeam from which the rope would hang. In the clearing it stood like a dark monument to justice deferred, visible from most of the settlement's buildings. With mixed feelings watched its construction Sheriff Thomas Granger. In the law he believed that consequences for crimes committed required justice. But he also couldn't shake the memory of Ruth hanging in her cell, or the way Abigail had looked at him in the courtroom, or the dark history that had been revealed through this investigation. Most bothered him the question that kept circling through his mind: if less isolated had been the community, music, less willing to look away from oddities and disappearances, could any of this have been prevented? Were they all, in some small way, complicit in the horror that had unfolded? On the morning of December 28, brutally cold was the temperature, well below freezing, with a sharp wind that cut through even the heaviest coats. Overcast was the sky, threatening more snow, and with people was filled the clearing where the scaffold stood. Nearly the entire population of Red Hollow and surrounding areas, perhaps 200 souls in total, bundled against the cold, and gathered to witness justice. Just after sunrise was brought from the jail Abigail Whitford. A simple grey dress provided by the county she wore, her hands bound in front of her face calm and composed. Her escorted to the scaffold Marshal Brennan and 2 deputies while ahead walked Sheriff Granger, ensuring the path was clear. Silently parted the crowd as they approached. Some people averting their eyes, others staring with undisguised hatred or morbid curiosity. Back were kept children, though many had been brought to witness, their parents believing that seeing evil punished would provide some moral lesson. Without assistance climbed the steps to the scaffold Abigail, her movement steady despite the bindings on her wrists. On the platform she stood and looked out over the assembled crowd, her expression unreadable. The county official who would oversee the execution, a judge named Harlan Marcus, read the charges and the sentence in a formal, steady voice that carried across the clearing. He asked Abigail if she had any final words. She did. "You think this ends with me," said Abigail, her voice clear and strong despite the cold. "You think justice is being served today, that order is being restored. But wrong you are. The old ways don't die, music, because one person you kill. In the blood they live, in the memory, in the land itself." She paused, scanning the crowd, her gaze settling on certain faces, people who looked away uncomfortably. "That survival requires sacrifice my mother taught me," she continued. "That the weak must feed the strong. That the old powers demand tribute in blood and flesh. Evil you call it. Truth I call it. And the truth doesn't change just because you refuse to see it." "Enough," sharply said Judge Marcus. "Over is your time." Forward stepped the hangman, a professional brought in from another county, with the hood and noose. But her head shook Abigail. "The hood I don't want. To see I want. Your faces as I go into the dark I want to watch so I can remember who to haunt." Considered the judge, then nodded. Unusual it was, but not forbidden. Around Abigail's neck placed the hangman the noose, adjusting it carefully to ensure a quick death. Against her skin scratched the thick rope, but she didn't flinch. At the base of the scaffold stood Sheriff Granger, his hand resting on his pistol, not because he expected trouble, but because comforting was the weight of it, a reminder of order and authority in the face of chaos. Everything checked one final time the hangman, then stepped back and looked at Judge Marcus, who nodded. Music opened the trap door. Through the opening dropped Abigail Whitford, and with a terrible crack that echoed across the clearing went taut the rope. For a moment swung her body, then still went. In silence watched the crowd, some people making the sign of the cross, others simply staring with grim satisfaction. After the required time had passed, forward came Dr. Whitmore and examined the body, confirming death. "Gone she is," quietly he announced. But as they prepared to cut her down, something strange happened. The wind, which had been steady all morning, completely died suddenly. Utterly still became the air, oppressively so, as if holding its breath were the world. And in that stillness, several people later swore they heard something, a low, rhythmic sound, like chanting or singing in that same unknown language Abigail had used in her cell. Only a moment it lasted. Then with a fierce gust returned the wind that rattled the scaffold and sent from the surrounding trees a shower of snow falling. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature felt Sheriff Granger. Around at the crowd he looked and saw his own unease reflected in many faces. Muttering were people, making protective signs, backing away from the scaffold as if something unclean it had become. "Get her down and buried," ordered Marshal Brennan. Quickly. Down cut they Abigail's body and placed it in a plain pine coffin that had been prepared. No church service there would be, no blessing. In unconsecrated ground on the far edge of the settlement would she be buried, away from the proper cemetery, with no marker to show where she lay. Already had been buried there Ruth 3 weeks earlier in an unmarked grave beside where her sister would rest. As the small burial party carried the coffin toward the burial site, something noticed Sheriff Granger that made him pause. Into the trunk of a nearby tree was carved one of those symbols, the circular pattern with radiating lines. Certain he was that there yesterday it hadn't been. This path himself he had checked. "Marshal," quietly he called, pointing to the carving. Over came Brennan and examined it, his expression darkening. "Recently here has been someone. But who?" "Everyone's been at the execution." At each other they looked, both thinking the same thing, but neither wanting to voice it. What if others there were? What if the Whitfords' twisted beliefs had infected someone else in the community? Someone who remained hidden, waiting. "The Whitford cabin again we need to search," said Brennan. "More thoroughly this time. Look for any records, any indication that Maeve or her daughters were teaching others." Quickly was completed the burial without ceremony. Into the frozen ground was lowered the coffin, covered with earth and stones, and left unmarked. To burn the cabin wanted some of the men to erase every trace of the Whitfords from the land, but against it argued Sheriff Granger. "If records there are, evidence of other people involved, preserve it we need. Potential proof of continuing crimes we can't destroy." So left standing was the cabin, though sealed it was and placed under guard. Over the next several days, an exhaustive search of the property conducted Granger and Brennan. More bones in hidden locations throughout the woods they found. Journals kept by Maeve Whitford they found, written partially in English and partially in what appeared to be Scots Gaelic, describing rituals and beliefs passed down through her family line. Most disturbing of all, a list of names they found, 15 in total, with dates beside each one. To the estimated times of the disappearances corresponded the dates. Crossed out was each name, and beside each written a phrase in Gaelic that Dr. Whitmore eventually translated as sacrifice completed. Samuel Hicks was the last name on the list. But below his crossed-out name, 3 more names were written in fresh ink, not yet crossed out. Names of people who still lived in Red Hollow. "My God," breathed Granger when he saw them. "More she was planning. Or someone else's," grimly said Brennan. "Recently were added these names. No more than a few weeks old is the ink. Before she was arrested must have written them Abigail." Immediately to warn the 3 people whose names appeared on the list they went. A young widow named Sarah Crawford, an elderly trapper named Joseph Lynch, and a drifter who had been working odd jobs in the area named Daniel Marsh. Terrified by the news were all 3. Her belongings packed Sarah Crawford and left Red Hollow that same day, going to stay with family in another state. To leave his home refused Joseph Lynch, but heavily armed himself and rarely went outside. Disappeared entirely Daniel Marsh. Whether he fled or met some other fate, no one ever discovered. Through January and February of 1892 continued the investigation, but no evidence of other conspirators was ever found. That alone had acted the Whitfords appeared, that their terrible rituals had been a family secret that died with Abigail. But profound and lasting was the damage to Red Hollow. To leave began families, unwilling to stay in a place tainted by such horror. Collapsed property values. Closed the trading post. Within 2 years, nearly abandoned was Red Hollow, and within 5 years, from maps entirely it had disappeared. Its remaining residents scattered, its buildings left to decay, its name deliberately forgotten. 4 years stood empty the Whitford cabin, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Avoided it people, and stories began to circulate. Tales of strange lights seen in the windows at night, of voices heard chanting in the woods, of travelers who took the old trail past the property and were never seen again. As superstition were dismissed most of these stories, the kind of folklore that grows up around places where terrible things have happened. But from reliable sources came some of the accounts, people who had no reason to lie. In 1897, in the area reported a surveying team working finding the remains of the cabin burned to the ground, though no one in the surrounding settlements had seen smoke or reported a fire. Cold were the ashes, weeks or months old, but scattered among them were bones, human bones, that couldn't be explained by the known victims of the Whitfords. Sheriff Thomas Granger, who had retired from law enforcement in 1895 to run a general store in a town 50 miles from Red Hollow, about the surveyor's report heard. To the site personally he traveled, driven by a need he couldn't fully explain. What he found troubled him deeply. Indeed, burned was the cabin, reduced to charred timbers and ash. But into every tree in a wide circle around the ruins were carved those symbols, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, covering every available surface of bark. And in the exact center of where the cabin had stood, a cairn of stones had arranged someone with a crude wooden marker bearing 2 names, Abigail and Ruth. There had been someone. Honored them had someone. His findings to the authorities reported Granger, but by then considered closed was the case, the perpetrators dead, the community dispersed. For reopening an investigation into events that everyone wanted to forget there was no appetite. To his store and his new life he returned, but what he'd seen he never forgot. And for the rest of his days he lived until 1921 on newspapers from across the region he kept watch, looking for reports of unusual disappearances, unexplained symbols, or ritualistic crimes that might indicate the Whitfords' legacy had spread beyond Red Hollow. Several cases he found that troubled him, that bore certain similarities to what he'd encountered in 1891. But a connection he could never prove, and without proof he remained silent, unwilling to sound like a madman chasing ghosts. Believing that he had stopped something terrible died Thomas Granger, but never being entirely certain that all of it he had stopped. More than a century has passed since the Whitford sisters were arrested, tried, and one way or another removed from the world. Deep Forest is now the location of Red Hollow, indistinguishable from the surrounding wilderness, except to those who know exactly where to look and what to look for. As a curiosity have documented the case local historians, a dark chapter in Appalachian history involving disturbed individuals influenced by Old World superstitions. In county archives are sealed the official records, available to researchers, but rarely accessed. What closure was possible received the families of the victims, those that could be identified. Away moved many of them, seeking to start fresh in places where the Whitford name meant nothing. Never redeveloped was the cabin site. Empty forest it remains, avoided by hunters and hikers who know the area's history. Cursed is the land itself, some say, that nothing grows properly in the soil where the cabin stood, that animals avoid the clearing even now. Whether true this is or simply local legend built on the foundation of genuine horror is impossible to say. What is certain is this: rituals that resulted in the deaths of at least 15 people over a span of decades practiced the Whitford sisters. They believed they were following ancient wisdom, that they were ensuring their survival through sacred acts. But what they were truly doing was perpetuating a cycle of violence born from trauma, isolation, and beliefs that should have died generations earlier. Never showed remorse. Abigail destroyed her. Ruth's remorse. Equally tragic in their own way are both outcomes. One of the most disturbing and least discussed cases in American criminal history remains the story of the Whitford sisters. A reminder that monsters are not born from supernatural forces, but from human choices, human beliefs, and human desperation.